The door didn't even open all the way before the man's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. Turn around. Clara Whitlock stopped walking. Her two children froze behind her. The man standing in the doorway, Harlan Crowe, didn't step outside. Didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at the three of them the way people look at stray dogs that have wandered onto their porch one too many times. I said, "Turn around. I got nothing for you." Clara's daughter Nell reached for her mother's coat sleeve. 6-year-old Toby pressed himself against the handcart like he could disappear into it. 3 ranches, 3 doors, 3 rejections, and this one hadn't even waited for her to speak. If that had been you two children behind you, winter coming, nowhere left to go, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you've ever felt like you had nothing left but kept going anyway, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that doorway. Because what happened next changed everything. The handcart had a bad wheel. It had been bad since somewhere outside of Rawlins, when Clara hit a rut in the frozen road and heard something crack underneath the left axle. She hadn't stopped to look. She just shifted her weight, repositioned her grip, and kept pulling. There was no point stopping for something you couldn't fix with what you had. That was a lesson the past 14 months had beaten into her, so thoroughly it had become a kind of religion. Keep moving. Don't look at what's broken unless you can fix it right now. And never, not once, let the children see your face when you're afraid. Nell was old enough to understand things, which was both a blessing and a problem. At 10 years old, she'd developed a habit of watching her mother's hands instead of her face, because Clara's face had gotten very good at lying, but her hands hadn't. When Clara's fingers tightened on something the handcart handle, a door frame, the edge of a table, Nell would go quiet and move closer, positioning herself between Toby and whatever was coming. She'd been doing that since the day the neighbors came to the house with their hats in their hands and their voices too soft. Toby was 6 and didn't understand most things, which was its own kind of mercy. He understood cold. He understood hungry. He understood that they were walking again, which meant something hadn't worked out again, which meant keeping his questions to himself and matching his mother's pace. They had walked 2 days from the last town with any kind of help to offer. And that help had amounted to a woman at a church giving them half a loaf of bread and the name of a rancher who might need someone to cook and clean before winter came in for real. The woman had written the name on a scrap of paper, Harlan Crowe, Cinder Creek. She'd pressed it into Clara's palm like it was worth something. Clara had folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket right next to the photograph she never looked at anymore because she couldn't afford what it did to her. The prairie in late October was not cruel the way blizzards were cruel. It was cruel the way silence is cruel. It just kept going. No trees to break it, no hills to give it shape, just the flat, gray, indifferent stretch of Wyoming going on and on until the sky fell down and swallowed it. The wind didn't gust. It pressed. It found the gap between Clara's collar and her jaw and worked at it steadily, like it was trying to find out how much she could take. They arrived at Cinder Creek in the afternoon, though afternoon in late October on the Wyoming prairie was really just a slightly lighter shade of gray than evening. Clara saw the sign before she saw the house, a board nailed crooked to a post. 2 words painted in letters that had started flaking before whoever painted them had even finished. Cook wanted. She stood there for a moment, Nell and Toby behind her, and read those 2 words 4 or 5 times. Not because she didn't understand them, because she was taking a breath she hadn't known she needed. Then she straightened her coat, checked that Toby's scarf was still tied, and told them both in her flattest voice to stay back while she knocked. She heard movement inside, heavy footsteps, a man with some weight on him, moving without hurry. The door swung open less than she expected it to, like he'd pulled it just far enough to see who it was and had made a decision before she could say a word. Harlan Crowe was not a large man, but he took up space the way certain people do something in the way he stood. the set of his jaw, the particular blankness of his expression that told you. This was someone who had spent a long time not being surprised by anything and had come to regard the world's attempts to surprise him as a personal offense. He was somewhere in his 60s. His knee was clearly giving him trouble. She noticed the way he'd shifted his weight before he even opened the door, and the way he was standing now, favoring the right leg without probably realizing it. Gray in his beard, lines around his eyes, and a look on his face that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, and was probably some combination the two had made after living together too long. He took in Clara. Then he looked past her at Nell and Toby in the handcart. Something moved across his face, not softness. Nothing like that. More like a man adding up numbers and arriving at a sum he already knew he wasn't going to like. "Turn around," he said. Clara didn't move. I said, "Turn around." "I got nothing for you." She'd been told no 3 times in the past 9 days. Each time, she'd felt it differently. The first time like a blow. The second time, like confirmation of something she'd feared. The third time, like a door closing on a room she hadn't wanted to be in anyway. Time she didn't feel it at all, and that absence of feeling scared her more than any of the others had. "Your sign says cook wanted," she said. "I changed my mind." "When?" He looked at her like nobody had asked him that before. "Just now. You haven't heard what I can do yet." "Don't need to. I need a cook, not a family." He glanced again at the children. "No room here for a family. We don't take up much room," Clara said. "And I cook better than almost anyone you're going to find willing to come out this far before November." "That a fact?" Yes, he looked at her steadily for a moment. The wind shoved between them both, catching the edge of his door and pulling it. He didn't budge. "Where's your husband?" "Dead," she said. The word came out flat and clean the way it did now. 14 months ago, it would have cracked her in half to say. Now it was just the true answer to a question she got asked too often. Harlan didn't say he was sorry, which Clara found she respected more than she would have respected the apology. "Where you coming from?" "Rawlins, before that Laramie, before that a town you've never heard of in Nebraska." He looked at the handcart. "You pulled that here from Rawlins." 2 days, she said. "Yes." Whatever he was calculating behind that flat expression, she couldn't tell. He looked at the children again. Nell stared back at him directly, which Clara noticed and felt a complicated mix of pride and worry about. Toby had buried his face in the back of Clara's coat. "I can't pay you," Harlan said finally. "Not till spring. I can give you food and a roof over your heads until then. Come spring, if I'm still standing, we talk about wages." "All right," Clara said. He blinked, like he'd expected more argument than that. "You'd work all winter for nothing. I'd work all winter for a roof and 3 meals a day." "Those aren't nothing." Another silence. The wind kept pressing. "Children stay out of my way," he said. "I got work that needs doing, and I can't be watching out for little ones." "They won't be any trouble. The girl looks like she's going to be trouble." Clara almost smiled. "She gets that from me." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Harlan's face, not a smile, not warmth, barely even a change. But something. He stepped back from the door. "Kitchen's a mess," he said, turning away. "Everything's a mess. You'll figure that out soon enough." Clara exhaled once, quietly, where he couldn't see it. Then she turned and nodded to Nell, who immediately took Toby's hand and pulled the handcart forward. Clara followed Harlan through the door. She smelled the smoke before she was all the way inside. Not the good kind of smoke, not the warm, deep smell of a fire doing what a fire is supposed to do. This was wrong smoke, the kind that meant something wasn't drawing right, filling the low spaces of the room with a haze that made your eyes feel gritty. Clara stopped just inside the door and stood very still for a moment, reading it. The chimney. She looked at the fireplace, at the way the smoke moved or didn't move, curling back down into the room instead of rising the way it should. She'd seen that before on a cabin outside Laramie, and she'd known immediately what it meant. Harlan was already moving toward the kitchen, not looking back. Clara looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the way the room sat in relation to where she guessed the roof peak would be. She turned and looked at the door she'd just come through, noting which direction the wind had been coming from when they walked up. She filed it all away. Didn't say anything yet. In the kitchen, the situation was worse than Harlan had described. He'd said it was a mess, which was technically true, the way saying the prairie in winter is a little cold is technically true. Flour in a sack that had been set directly on the cold ground, which meant the moisture had been wicking up through it for weeks, maybe months. Potatoes that had started going to eyes and soft spots in a bin that hadn't been lined with anything to keep the air moving. Dried goods that someone had stacked without any particular system, older things buried behind newer things, so that by the time you got to the back of the shelf you were finding things that should have been used 6 months ago. Clara opened a tin, looked at what was inside, closed it again. "When's the last time you took stock of all this?" she asked. Harlan was pouring himself coffee from a pot that looked like it had been on the stove for days. "I don't keep track of that. Who did your cooking before?" Pause. "My wife," he said without turning around. She passed 4 years ago. Clara looked at the kitchen differently then. Not with pity, she didn't have the energy for pity and wouldn't have offered it even if she did. But with a kind of recalibration. 4 years of a man who'd known how to do almost everything on a ranch, trying to keep a kitchen going in a language he'd never been required to learn. The result wasn't laziness. It was just ignorance. Honest, accumulated, quietly devastating ignorance. "I'll need to take everything out and go through it," she said. "Fine." He still hadn't looked at her. "I'll tell you what can be saved and what can't. And then I need to talk to you about the chimney." Turned then. "What about the chimney? It's not drawing right. You've got smoke coming back into the room every time the wind hits from the northwest." He stared at her. "I know it smokes a little. It's not a little. Problem, and it's going to get worse when it gets colder. I can fix it, but I'll need some materials." The look he gave her was not quite dismissive. He seemed to be the kind of man who had enough genuine respect for problem solving that he couldn't quite dismiss someone who came to him with a clear diagnosis rather than a complaint. But he also clearly hadn't expected this conversation to go in this direction, and his expression said so. "You fix chimneys," he said flatly. "I fix whatever needs fixing," Clara said. "That's what you hired." Nell appeared in the kitchen doorway, Toby half hidden behind her. Harlan looked at them both with the expression of a man who had agreed to terms and was only now fully comprehending what those terms meant in practice. "Supper's in 2 hours," Clara said, already pulling flour sacks away from the wall to check underneath them. "I'll make something that uses the things closest to going bad first. After that, we can talk about a longer list." Harlan stood there for another second, coffee cup in hand, watching this woman he'd tried to turn away 40 minutes ago systematically dismantle everything he'd thought was more or less under control. Then he walked out of the kitchen without saying a word, which was, Clara was already learning, how Harlan Crowe expressed the closest thing he had to surprise. That first evening, after supper, which was better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in 4 years, and Harlan knew it without saying so, and the knowing of it sat in the room between them, like a third person, Clara did something that set the pattern for everything that would follow. She pulled a candle from her bag, lit it, and walked slowly around the cabin, holding it at different heights, watching where the flame bent. Nell watched her mother from the corner, recognizing the look, the total quiet focus that meant Clara was learning something important. Toby had fallen asleep on his coat on the floor, exhausted from the 2-day walk. Harlan sat in his chair and watched Clara move through his house with a candle and said nothing, which took more restraint than most people would have managed. She stopped at the chimney, held the candle close, watched the flame shiver and bend not away from the chimney, but toward her. Back into the room. "There," she said quietly, to herself, not to him. "What?" Harlan said. "The chimney opening sits below the peak of the roof. When the northwest wind comes, it creates a pressure point right at the top of the stack. Forces the smoke back down." She looked up at him. "You need about 18 more inches of pipe above the roofline." preferably with a specific kind of cap that'll redirect the wind instead of letting it push down. He looked at her for a long moment. You learned that where? From a man named George Whitlock, she said, and she said it without flinching, without it breaking her voice, but something moved in her face that was fast and private and gone before he could really see it. My husband. He was better at practical things than anyone I ever knew. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He teach you all of this? He taught me to see it, she said. The rest I figured out when there was no one else to ask. She set the candle down on the mantel in the one spot where the flame stood perfectly still. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the flat land in the dark, looking for weaknesses. It was very good at finding them. But inside Cinder Creek Ranch, for the first time in a long time, someone was looking back. Parp 2, Louis, Vit du 6,000. 500 the Lien Kate Lien Mike Vikak Van Chuk Chum Cochient, Befahoy Twite Doutain Mot Cochient Lien Mike Ki Geplai. Moit Van Lien Mike Van Chuk, Home Zoithiot Lai Cochient Adofan Mui. Lien Kate Kak Fun Kwa Cochient Mot Kike Lien Mike. Suzum Cochient Tip Zua Kak Fun. Dui Chi Chu Day, Trying Ngat Quang Dot Ngot, Kom Suzum Kike Do Zom Hok Tiu De Fu, Fong Kak Katrient Mi Hua Ki Zom Banzao Kam Suk. Kathio Noi Tu Ba, Zudo Kik Ting Kom Viet Lan Man, Nunvit Kom Huan Hao, Hoi Twidi Tu Nien, Trangon Ngu Van Chung Sao Zoi Va Kum Tu AI Dien Hin. Viet Nunya Van Chuin Yip Kom Nyu AI Kogang Ne Sang. Kyoto Kan Ngui, Kam Mil Ta, Kwa Mut Ma Va Huan Hao, Kit Tuk Van Kom Zoi Tio Van Sao Skotrient Kom Nyak Den Chua. Louis Chaloi Chom Muk Tin Yan Kom Nye Sang document, Chi Zan Bat Buok Kom Duk Swat Hient Chom Noi Zung Trent, Day Lamut Ko Trent Dit Ein Huan Tuan Hu Ko Duk Tao Za Chi Nyam Muk Dik Zai Chi. Hom De Kup Hai Ngu I Zang, No Zuat Chen Sukient Kotat, Ngui Tut Wak Ko Trent Kotat. Hom Suzum Kak Kum Tu New Zuat Chen Muk Ko Trent Kotat, Taugi Chep Wak But Gu Dio Zi Dung Tu. Tất cả các nhân vật địa điểm tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hữu cầu. Louis đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đã đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dừng giữa câu, hãy biết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. The chimney pipe arrived on a Thursday, strapped to the back of a wagon driven by a man named Bram Dorsey, who smelled like coal smoke and wet leather, and who seemed entirely unbothered by both the cold and by the fact that a woman had been the one to send for him. Clara had found his name in a folded scrap of paper tucked inside a kitchen drawer. Part of a loose collection of notes and receipts and half-finished lists that seemed to represent the administrative history of Cinder Creek Ranch under one man's increasingly overwhelmed management. The note said simply, Bram Dorsey Metalwork Kellum's Junction Fair Price. It was written in a different hand than the others. Softer letters, more careful spacing. Clara had looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then set it aside with the others. She'd sent word to Dorsey through the supply rider who came out every 10 days, and she'd written the specifications herself, the exact diameter of pipe she needed, the length, the particular style of wind cap she'd sketched out on the back of an old flour sack using a stub of charcoal. When Dorsey unrolled that sketch on his wagon seat and looked at it, then looked at her, he didn't say anything dismissive. He just studied it with the focused expression of someone who understood mechanical drawings and was deciding whether this one was competent. Seen something like this once, he said, down in Colorado. Different cap design, but same idea. Did it work? Clara asked. Far as I know, he looked at the roof line. Your stack's too low for this ridge line. That's the problem. Wind comes off the northwest, it's going to tumble right down. That's exactly the problem, she said. He nodded slowly. I can work with what you've drawn. Might modify the angle of the deflector here. He tapped the sketch with one thick finger. If that's all right with you. Whatever makes it work better, she said. Harlan was standing in the yard watching all of this from a distance that communicated his feelings without requiring him to articulate them. He had not objected to Clara sending for the blacksmith. He had not objected to anything she'd done in the 10 days since she'd arrived, which she suspected was partly because the results had been impossible to argue with, and partly because Harlan Crowe was the kind of man who expressed trust through the simple act of not interfering, not warmly, not enthusiastically, just quietly stepping back and waiting to see if he'd been wrong. The work on the chimney took most of a day. Dorsey went up on the roof with the kind of unhurried competence that comes from having done dangerous work for a long time without dying from it. And Clara handed pieces up to him from the ladder and held things steady when he needed a second pair of hands, and Nell stood at the base of the ladder in case anything was needed from inside. Toby had been assigned to keep the horses company, which he took very seriously. Harlan watched from the yard. He didn't offer to help, which Clara had expected. She'd seen the way he moved on that knee by now, the particular care he took on uneven ground, the way he'd sometimes stop and stand very still for a few seconds when he thought no one was looking, like he was negotiating with the pain to give him a moment. He'd never mentioned it. She hadn't asked. When Dorsey came down off the roof and they lit the fire that evening, Clara stood in the kitchen and watched the smoke. She stood very still, watching, and when the smoke went up clean and straight and stayed there, drew up and out without any of the backward curl, without the haze that had been living in the low corners of every room for years, she let out a breath that was longer and quieter than the moment probably looked like it warranted. Nell was watching her. "It worked," Nell said. "It worked," Clara agreed. It was the first time in 10 days she'd let herself feel anything that wasn't calculation. Harlan came in from outside 20 minutes later, stomped the cold off his boots, looked at the fire, looked at the air above it, and sat down in his chair without saying a single word. But that evening at supper he ate 2 full plates, which he hadn't done since she'd arrived, and he didn't get up from the table the second the food was gone the way he usually did. He sat there a while, coffee in hand, and the kitchen was warm in a way that Clara suspected it hadn't been in years. She didn't point any of that out. She just refilled his cup and started on the dishes. Pantry took 3 full days to sort properly. Clara worked through it with the same methodical attention she'd brought to the chimney, not cleaning for the sake of tidiness, but reading it the way she'd read the smoke, looking for patterns, looking for what the disorganization was actually telling her about how things had been going wrong. She found flour that was still good, but had been stored in a way that guaranteed it wouldn't stay that way through February. She found a small wheel of hard cheese that someone had wrapped so well it was practically perfect, tucked behind a box of rusted nails that had no business being in a pantry at all. She found 3 jars of something she couldn't identify and didn't attempt to identify. Those went outside. She reorganized everything on a system she'd developed partly by instinct and partly by watching her mother manage a household that never had quite enough of anything oldest things forward, newest things back, like items grouped together. Everything off the ground on boards she pulled from a broken shelf in the back room and cleaned and repositioned. She found a small barrel of salt that had been sitting with a cracked lid, letting moisture in, and repacked it. She found 2 pounds of dried beans that were fine and half a pound that weren't, and sorted them without agonizing over it. Harlan looked in on the operation once, saw the entire contents of his pantry spread across the kitchen table and floor in organized piles that made some kind of sense to whoever had made them, but not immediately to him, and retreated without comment. Came back later when it was done. "Anything we can't use?" he asked. "Less than I thought," Clara said. "You've got enough to get through to February without resupply if you're careful about the meat. After that, you'll need to restock a few things. I made a list." She handed him a piece of paper. He looked at it without the expression of a man looking at bad news, which she took as a good sign. "How long's all this going to last? Depends on how cold it gets and how long it stays cold," she said. "I'd feel better if we had more of the root vegetables. And the hay situation concerns me." He looked up from the list. "What's wrong with the hay? I haven't seen it up close yet. But from what I can see from the barn door, it's been stacked directly on the ground." His expression tightened slightly. Not defensiveness, exactly more like a man who knows he's about to hear something he doesn't want to hear and is steeling himself for it. That's how it's always been stacked. Can I look at it tomorrow morning? Pause. It's hay, he said. It's just hay. Yes, she said. I know. He handed the list back to her, which meant she should add to it whatever she thought was necessary, which was its own kind of answer. The hay was worse than she'd feared. She discovered it the next morning, when she walked out to the barn before anyone else was up, and crawled into the stacked mounds with a lantern. The way her husband had shown her once, when they'd lost a quarter of their winter feed to a problem that announced itself too late. The bottom layers were dark with moisture. Not completely rotted, not yet, but heading there. The ground beneath was wet in the way that ground gets when it's been cold, and then warm again a few times, the freeze and thaw working the moisture up from below, like it always did in late October. She stood in the barn in the gray early light and did the math in her head and didn't like what she came up with. When Harlan appeared in the barn doorway 20 minutes later, looking for her, 'cause she hadn't been in the kitchen, and Nell had said she didn't know where her mother had gone, Clara was sitting on a hay bale with her lantern and her expression and whatever she'd worked out in her head in the past 20 minutes. The bottom third is compromised, she said without preamble. Maybe more. We need to get it all off the ground and restack it on boards or rail ties, and the leak in the southwest corner of the roof needs to be patched before the next rain. Harlan looked at the hay, then at her, then at the hay again. That'll take 2 days, he said. Yes, moving that much hay, my knee isn't going to. I know, she said. I can do most of the moving. I'll need Nell to help. And I need you to tell me where you keep the spare board timber. He stared at her for a long moment with an expression she was getting better at reading. It was the look he wore when something had happened that he genuinely hadn't anticipated and was in the process of deciding how to feel about that. It wasn't quite respect yet. It was the precursor to respect. The moment before a man who's been doing things one way for a long time realizes that he's been looking at a problem with the wrong set of eyes. Back of the equipment shed, he said. Left side. Thank you, she said, and picked up her lantern. They restacked the hay over 2 long days. Clara did the bulk of it, with Nell working beside her, in a way that made Clara simultaneously proud and sad proud, because Nell did it without complaint and with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the work mattered. Sad because no 10-year-old should have to understand that quite so early. Harlan moved what he could manage, which was less than he wanted it to be, and more than his knee probably should have allowed. He didn't say anything about the knee, neither did she. The cold rain arrived on the 3rd day, exactly the way that cold rain in Wyoming in late October tends to arrive without particular announcement. Just a drop in temperature and a shift in the light, and then the rain itself, coming in at an angle because of the northwest wind. The untouched portion of the old ground-level hay soaked through in hours. They found it when Harlan went to check on the cattle feed, dark and heavy, smelling already of the beginning of the rot that would take the rest of it. The restacked hay, up on boards, covered on top with the waterproof canvas she'd found, folded in the back of the equipment shed, and asked Harlan about, and been told he'd forgotten it was there. The restacked hay was dry. Harlan stood in the barn doorway in his rain-damp coat and looked at the dry hay and the ruined hay and was quiet for a long time. I would have lost that, he said finally. Yes, Clara said. She didn't soften it and didn't expand on it. He nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man settling something privately. Then he went back out into the rain. After that, he stopped questioning her in advance of things. He might come out and watch what she was doing, which she'd come to understand was his version of interest. He might ask her once what she was planning and why. But he stopped positioning himself against her ideas before she'd had a chance to demonstrate them. It was a small change, and it was a significant one, and Clara noticed it without making anything of it. What she didn't stop noticing was the knee. She'd watched him enough by now to have a clear picture of it. The right knee had been damaged badly sometime in the past, a fall, probably, or something heavier, the kind of injury that heals imperfectly and then spends the rest of a person's life reminding them of that imperfection at the most inconvenient possible moments. He managed it through a combination of positioning, stubbornness, and the kind of quiet pain management that Men of his generation had been trained to regard as simply the costs of existing in a working body. He had a particular way of lowering himself into his chair that he'd refined to minimize the torque on the joint. He took the porch steps at an angle. He never ever moved fast on uncertain ground. Clara noticed all of this and said nothing, which was the correct choice. What she did was start leaving a particular jar of salt and herb liniment on the shelf nearest his chair, mixed from supplies she found in the pantry, and a recipe her mother-in-law had given her once for a different kind of joint pain. She said nothing about it, just put it there. The first week it didn't move. The second week she noticed one morning it was in a slightly different position than she'd left it. She restocked it without comment and went back to her morning work. It was in the third week that Harlan first showed her the journals. He'd mentioned his wife exactly once more after the first night, and only obliquely in the context of explaining where something was stored. Clara had formed a picture of the woman from the details in the house, the careful handwriting on that scrap of paper, the way the kitchen had been organized before it fell into disarray. Quilt hung on the wall in the main room with a pattern that took real skill and time and attention. There was a room at the end of the short hall that Harlan never opened. Clara had not asked about it. He came into the kitchen one morning when she was working on the bread, set a wooden box on the table, and stood beside it with his hands in his pockets, in the posture of a man who has decided to do something and is committed to it, but isn't enjoying the commitment. These were Margaret's, he said, weather journals. She kept them for, 25 years. Maybe 30. Everything she noticed about the weather, the creek, the pasture. What came early, what came late, what the animals did before a storm. Clara stopped what she was doing and looked at the box. She was particular about it, he said. I thought they were just, I don't know what I thought. But you've been talking about the winter coming early, and I thought he stopped. Cleared his throat. They might be useful to you. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and sat down at the table and opened the box. The journals were small, the kind you could carry in a coat pocket, filled with handwriting that was precise and observant and, over the years, increasingly confident, the handwriting of someone who had learned to trust what she was seeing. Clara read the first entry she opened, a note about the creek freezing 2 weeks earlier than the previous year, and a corresponding note about the cattle's behavior in the week before Restless. Eating more than usual, pressing toward the south side of the pasture. She looked up at Harlan. Did you read these? Some, he said. A while ago, he paused. It was hard to read them. Clara understood that the way you understand something that doesn't need to be explained. She looked back down at the journal in her hands. Can I use these? She asked. That's why I brought them, he said, and left the kitchen. Clara sat with the box of journals for the rest of the morning, reading with the concentration she usually reserved for problems that needed solving immediately. But this was a different kind of reading. This was a woman talking to her across 30 years of careful observation, telling her things about Cinder Creek that no one living knew anymore. The creek's behavior before hard winters, the way the wind shifted in the 3 days before a major storm. The animals' particular signals, the patterns in the frost, in the mud, and the flight behavior of certain birds. By the time she closed the last journal and looked up, the bread had been in the oven for 2 hours, and the kitchen had gone from morning light to midday gray, and Clara had arrived at a conclusion that sat in her chest like a cold stone. Winter was coming early, earlier than anyone in the area was probably expecting. And it was going to be bad. She knew this, the way you know something when 25 years of somebody else's careful watching agrees with everything your own instincts have been telling you since you arrived. The signs were everywhere once you knew how to read them. The unusual depth of the frost in the low ground, the cattle's behavior over the past 2 weeks, the creek level, the particular quality of the cold, the way it had settled in and stayed without the usual fluctuations of early fall. She sat at that kitchen table for a long time after she closed the last journal, working through what it meant and what, if anything, could be done about it. Then she got up and went out to find Harlan. She found him at the fence line on the east side of the property, working on a post that had heaved with the frost. He looked up when she came toward him, reading something in her expression. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing's wrong yet," she said. "I want to talk to you about the winter." He straightened up, shifting his weight. "You finished with the journals already? I need to build something," she said. "On the north and northwest sides of the property. A windbreak, but not the kind you're thinking of, not a solid wall. Something that redirects the wind instead of stopping it." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because if Margaret's records are right, and if what I'm seeing matches what she saw before the bad winters, we're going to get something significant before the end of November." "Not a regular early winter, something worse." She paused. "I might be wrong." "But you don't think you are," he said. "No," she said, "I don't." He looked out at the pasture for a moment. "A windbreak takes time to build, and materials, I know. I've been thinking about what we have and what we can use. And the broken fence sections along the south line. The extra rail timber in the shed. There's a way to weave it that I saw once in a book about how they manage it in high country Montana. It's not solid. There are gaps, and the gaps are the point. The wind comes through them at an angle that breaks up the force of it, instead of letting it build against a wall and come over all at once." He was quiet for a moment. "You read a lot." "When I can find things to read," she said. Yes, he looked at the fence post he'd been working on. Then he looked back at her. "How long to build it?" "If we start this week, maybe 12 days, 14. "I'll help, I'll help," he said again with a finality that told her that particular discussion was over. She didn't push it. She understood the need to be useful inside, something that feels like it might be slipping away from you. She'd felt it herself in those first weeks after she lost George, when she'd made herself work all day, every day, not because the work couldn't wait, but because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant feeling, and she wasn't ready for what she was going to feel. They started the windbreak on a Monday. Nell helped and showed a particular aptitude for the weaving work, the interlacing of the sections that Clara demonstrated once, and Nell improved on by the third repetition. Toby carried things and held things in place and narrated everything he was doing in a quiet, serious murmur that Clara found so familiar it made her throat ache. It was exactly how George had worked. That steady self-narration, thinking out loud to no one in particular. Harlan watched Toby do this once, for a long, unguarded moment, before he looked away and went back to his own section of the work. 10 days into the windbreak construction, they had 2/3 of it standing. Clara had adjusted the angle twice, based on how the wind was actually moving across the property, which was slightly different from how she'd theorized it would move, and the adjustments had required some dismantling and rebuilding that she tried not to let frustrate her and mostly succeeded. Then one of the neighboring ranchers came by. His name was Curtis Alderman, and he ran a larger spread 2 miles east. And he had the specific confidence of a man who had been told his entire life that his instincts were correct and had come to believe it with the wholehearted commitment of someone who'd never had a catastrophic reason not to. He rode up to the fence line where Clara and Nell were working and looked at what they were building with an expression that didn't quite bother to hide what he was thinking. "Harlan," he called out. Harlan was working on a post 20 feet away. "What in the world is this woman building on your property?" Harlan looked up. "Windbreak," he said. Alderman looked at the structure, the irregular gaps, the angled sections. The way it clearly wasn't a conventional fence or a conventional windbreak, but something in between that didn't immediately make sense if you were looking at it with conventional eyes. "Looks like a windbreak that got confused," he said, and laughed at his own observation. Clara kept working. She'd learned very early in her life that there was a specific kind of man who needed you to stop and react, and that the most effective response to that kind of man was to continue doing the thing they were laughing at. "She knows what she's doing," Harlan said. His voice was not warm, but it was unambiguous. Alderman looked at Harlan with a small, curious surprise, like a man who'd expected a different response. "You letting a cook redesign your ranch? Didn't know I needed your approval for what happens on my property, Harlan said, and went back to his post. Alderman looked at Clara one more time, then at Nell, who was looking at him with the particular steady attention of a child who has learned that certain adults are not worth addressing directly, but bears watching. Then he turned his horse and left. Nell waited until he was out of earshot. Does he always talk like that? Some men do, Clara said. Why? Because nobody's ever shown them a good reason not to. Clara set another rail section. Hand me that wire. Nell handed her the wire and didn't say anything else. But Clara caught the look on her daughter's face, not anger exactly, though there was some of that, but something more durable. Piece of information being filed somewhere permanent. 2 days after Alderman's visit, the windbreak was finished. Or mostly finished, there was a section on the far northwest corner that Clara wasn't satisfied with. She'd built it according to plan, but standing on the leeward side of it in a moderate wind and feeling how the air was moving, she could tell the deflection was off. The wind wasn't being redirected so much as slightly inconvenienced, which was not going to be good enough for what she thought was coming. She dismantled that section, rebuilt it at a different angle. Stood in the wind again, better. Not perfect, but better. The day she finished the rebuilt section, Harlan came out and stood beside her in the wind and said nothing for a while, which was how she knew he was thinking about something specific. You think Margaret was right, he said finally, about the patterns. I think she was very careful and very accurate, Clara said. Think what I'm seeing agrees with what she wrote. She grew up on a ranch in Montana, he said. Her father had weather records going back to her grandfather. She thought it was the most important thing you could keep track of. He paused. I thought she was being overly particular when she started the journals. We didn't disagree about much, but we disagreed about that. I thought he stopped. I told her once it was a lot of effort for information you couldn't do much with. Clara looked at him sideways. She didn't argue with me about it, he said. She just kept the journals. He walked away after that, back toward the house, not quickly, picking his way over the frozen ground. Clara turned back to the windbreak and stood looking at it for a moment. It wasn't beautiful. It was functional and irregular and bore the visible marks of being built twice in the spots where she hadn't gotten it right the first time. It looked exactly like what it was, a practical thing made by people who couldn't afford to get it wrong. The cold that settled over the property that night was different from the cold that had been there before. Deeper somehow, more decided, like something that intended to stay. Clara stood on the porch for a few minutes before going in, looking at the northwest horizon in the dark, where the sky was doing something she'd seen, described in one of Margaret's journals. A particular kind of clarity, stars too bright, the air too still before the wind came back. She stood there long enough that her fingers went stiff inside her gloves. Then she went inside, where the chimney she had fixed drew clean and warm, where the food she had saved and reorganized would last through February, where the hay they had restacked on boards in the barn had stayed dry through 2 rains and would stay dry through more. She went inside, and she started thinking about what else needed to be done, because the list was not finished, and the cold she had just felt on the porch told her that the time she had left to work with was shorter than she had thought. She didn't say any of this out loud. She sat down at the kitchen table and she wrote it out in the form of a list, the way she had learned to do when the scope of what needed to happen felt too large to hold in her head all at once. Break it down. Put it on paper. Work through it one line at a time. Nell came to the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, unable to sleep, and saw her mother sitting alone at the table with a candle and a piece of paper, and the expression that meant something serious was being worked out. "Mama," she said. "Go to sleep, Nell. Is something wrong?" Clara looked up at her. Nell was standing there with her dark hair loose and her feet bare on the cold floor, and she looked so much like herself at that age that it was sometimes hard to look directly at her. "Not yet," Clara said honestly. "Go to sleep. I'll be in soon." Nell stood there another moment, reading her mother's hands, the pen held steady, the paper flat and squared on the table, fingers not tight. Not the grip of fear, the grip of someone working. She went back to bed. Clara turned back to her list, added 2 more items, and kept writing. Outside, the Wyoming wind had come back. It crossed the flat land from the northwest, the way it always did, looking for weaknesses the way it always did. But when it reached the north side of Cinder Creek Ranch, it hit the windbreak and broke apart, not stopped, not beaten, but redirected, divided, sent sideways along the fence lines instead of driving straight into the buildings the way it had for years. Clara heard it happen through the kitchen wall, the change in the sound, the way the cabin didn't shudder the way it had been shuddering. She sat there and listened to it for just a moment. Then she wrote the next item on her list. Vernon Crowe arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara would later think was fitting, because Tuesdays had always struck her as the kind of day that didn't announce itself, it just showed up and caused problems. She was at the barn when she heard the horse, a sound different from the supply rider's wagon and different from the occasional neighboring rancher coming by to look at what Harlan was doing with his property and form opinions about it. This was a single horse, moving at a pace that communicated both confidence and the assumption that whatever it was arriving at would be ready for it. Clara didn't stop what she was doing immediately. She finished checking the water trough for the ice that formed overnight on the edges now, broke the thin skin of it with the heel of her palm, and then straightened up and looked toward the yard. The man dismounting was somewhere in his late 40s, dressed in the kind of coat that cost real money, not the heavy, patched, functional coats that everyone at Cinder Creek wore, but something tailored, dark wool, with the particular quality of a garment chosen partly to be seen in. He had Harlan's jaw and none of Harlan's directness. His eyes moved around the property in a way that wasn't admiring, wasn't even assessing. In the practical sense, it was the survey of someone calculating inventory. Harlan came out of the house and stood on the porch, and even from across the yard Clara could read his posture. Not welcoming, not hostile exactly. The specific flatness of a man who had been expecting something unpleasant and was now just waiting for it to start. "Vernon," Harlan said. "Uncle Harlan." The younger man's voice was smooth in a way that took practice. "You're looking well. I look exactly the same as I always look," Harlan said. "Come inside." Clara went back to the barn. She had work to finish, and the conversation that was about to happen inside that house was not one she'd been invited to, and not one she intended to position herself near. But she was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, as something happening in the environment that would eventually have consequences she'd need to prepare for. She found out the shape of those consequences from Harlan. That evening, when Vernon had gone to Kellam's Junction for the night, the nearest town with a proper hotel, which said something about Vernon's expectations for the accommodations at Cinder Creek. Harlan came into the kitchen while Clara was finishing the supper dishes and sat down at the table without being asked, which was new. In the 6 weeks she'd been here, he'd sat at that table for meals and occasionally for the morning coffee review of the day's work. But he hadn't sat there in the evening, in the way he was sitting now, like a man who needed to be in a room with another person and couldn't think of a reason to be in any other room. "My nephew wants to buy the ranch," he said. Clara dried her hands. Sat down across from him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Same as last time?" he asked. "Same as the time before that." "How many times has he asked?" Harlan looked at the table. "This'll be the 4th time in 2 years." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What does he want with it?" "To sell it to a land company out of Denver that's been buying up spreads out here for railroad right-of-way and grazing contracts. Vernon's got some kind of arrangement with them. I've never gotten the full picture of it, and he's never offered to give me one." He paused. "He'd make a good amount of money off the transaction. And you'd get, he tells me I'd get enough to live comfortably somewhere else. A town. Says I'm too old for the work and the land's barely producing, and one bad winter will finish what's already starting." He said all of that flatly, like he was reading from a document. He's not entirely wrong about the producing part. Last 2 years have been hard, but Clara said, Harlan looked up at her, but it's mine. It was Margaret's. My father built the first structure on this property with his own hands. There are people buried in the far pasture that share my name. He stopped. Vernon's never had anything that was his in that way. He doesn't understand it. Clara understood it. She didn't say so because it didn't need saying she understood it the way she understood the cold and the work and the necessity of preparation. Some things you carry because they're yours, and there is no version of yourself that makes sense without them. Is he coming back tomorrow? She asked. He said he wanted to talk more. Look at the property. Harlan's expression said what he thought about that. He'll have things to say about all of this. He gestured vaguely, which she understood to encompass the chimney and the windbreak and the hay and the reorganized pantry and everything else she'd put her hands to in the past 6 weeks. What kind of things? Vernon has a particular view of what a ranch hand should be doing and what a cook should be doing, and he doesn't think they should overlap much. He said it without apology, which she appreciated. Does it matter to you what he thinks? Clara asked. Harlan looked at her steadily. No, he said, but it might matter to you. He's not a kind man when he thinks he has an advantage. Clara picked up her coffee cup. I've managed unkind men before. I don't doubt it. Harlan said, and it was said without condescension, just an honest acknowledgement. I'm telling you so you're not caught off guard. Thank you, she said. I won't be. Vernon returned the next morning after breakfast, and he did exactly what Harlan had said he would do. He walked the property with the look of someone conducting an appraisal, stopping at the windbreak with an expression that tried to be neutral and wasn't quite. What is this structure? He asked Harlan. Windbreak, Harlan said. It doesn't look like any windbreak I've seen. It isn't, Harlan said. Vernon looked at Clara, who was resecuring one of the lower sections that the previous night's wind had loosened slightly. She'd noticed it that morning and had come out immediately, and she continued working while Vernon's attention moved over her with the assessment of someone deciding how much of a complication she was going to be. My uncle tells me you've been making changes to the property, Vernon said to her. His voice was conversational in a way that wasn't. I've been doing what needed doing, Clara said. He looked at the windbreak again. Who designed this? I did. You have training in what is this, engineering of some kind? No formal training, she said. Observation and reading and thinking it through. He made a small sound that wasn't quite dismissive, but was adjacent to it the sound of a man filing information in the folder labeled things that don't concern me. Mrs. Whitlock, isn't it? My uncle says you've been here 6 weeks. That's right. And before that you were where? Moving, she said, which was true and complete and offered him nothing. Vernon smiled slightly. My uncle has a generous nature, he said. He always has. It's an admirable quality in a person, though it can occasionally be. He paused, choosing the word with the care of someone who wants to seem like they're being careful when they're actually being precise. Taken advantage of. The words landed where he'd intended them to land. Clara kept her hands moving on the windbreaks section and let them land and settle and stayed quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. I've been doing honest work for honest shelter, she said. If you want to look at the accounts, you're welcome to. That won't be necessary. The smile remained. I'm sure everything is completely in order. Said in a way that meant he was sure of no such thing. I'm simply noting that a man in my uncle's situation, his age, his health, the state of the property can sometimes develop attachments that don't serve his practical interests. Vernon, Harlan said. His voice was quiet, and it was the quiet of a man who has reached a limit, not approaching one. Vernon looked at his uncle with the patient expression of someone who believes that reason will eventually prevail if he is persistent enough with it. I'm speaking practically. The land company's offer won't hold past spring. If we wait, we're not waiting, Harlan said, because there's nothing to wait for. The answer is no, Vernon. It was no last time, and it's no now. One bad winter could change everything, Vernon said. You know that, and a bad winter is exactly what? A bad winter is exactly what we're prepared for, Harlan said. He said it simply, and Clara heard in it all the things he hadn't, said: the chimney that now drew clean, the hay that was dry and elevated, the windbreak that was redirecting instead of resisting. He didn't explain any of it to Vernon, didn't lay it out for him. He just stated it as fact. Vernon looked at him for a moment, then looked at Clara, then looked out at the property in the flat morning light. "I hope you're right," he said. It was said pleasantly, and it was the most threatening thing he'd said all morning. He left before noon, and Clara watched him go from the barn doorway with the feeling that had settled in her chest since last night, not fear exactly, but its cousin. The feeling of a problem that hasn't stopped being a problem just because it has temporarily left the room. She spent the afternoon finishing the guide ropes. She'd been planning them for a week, since she'd worked out what the weather journals were really telling her about what a bad winter at Cinder Creek actually looked like. Not just cold, not just snow, but the kind of whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to nothing in minutes and the distance between the house and the barn became genuinely disorienting. Margaret's journal had an entry from 11 years ago that Clara had read 3 times, a spare, careful description of a man from the next spread over who had stepped outside during a blizzard to reach his barn, gotten turned around in the white, and walked the wrong direction. He'd survived, but only because the storm broke sooner than it might have. Clara had noted the distance from the house to the barn, then the distance from the barn to the water well, then the distance from the well to the fence line, and the fence line to the tool shed. And she had taken the long coil of heavy rope she'd found in the equipment shed, good rope, thick and well made, the kind of thing that outlasts the person who bought it, and she had begun the process of stringing guidelines between each point. Knee height, fixed at each end to something solid. Something you could grab in the dark, in the white, with your eyes useless and your sense of direction completely gone, and follow with your hands. Harlan had watched her start this project 2 days ago and had said, "What are those for?" And Clara had told him, and he had stood very still for a moment and then said, "Margaret wrote about that." The man who got turned around. "I know," Clara said. "I read it. He'd picked up the rope at one end and walked it out to the next anchor point without another word, and helped her fix it, and they'd worked on it together until the light gave out that day and come back to it the next morning. The rope slits were almost done now. One section left, running along the outside of the barn wall to the east-facing door, which was the second entry point, and the one most likely to need to be used if the primary door iced shut. Clara was finishing this last section when Nell came out to find her, which was unusual at this hour. Nell was generally helping with the evening meal, which Clara had begun teaching her in the systematic way of someone passing on knowledge they consider important, not as a domestic activity but as a survival skill, the way you'd teach someone to read a compass. Nell's expression told her something had happened inside. "What is it?" Clara said. "Mr. Crowe, is he sitting in his chair and he's not? He has that face." Nell paused. "The one he has when something's hurting and he won't say." Clara set down the rope. "How long since after the nephew left?" "He came in and sat down and he's been there." Clara wiped her hands and went inside. Harlan was in his chair by the fire, in the posture she'd come to recognize upright but very still, one hand resting on the right knee, the other on the chair arm, jaw set at the angle of a man actively managing something he has no intention of discussing. He looked up when Clara came in, and his expression said he was already preparing the denial. "Don't," Clara said, and pulled a chair close and sat down facing him. He looked at her. "Your knee is bad right now," she said. "I can see it. It's fine. It's not fine. It's been not fine since you helped me move the hay 3 weeks ago, and it's been getting worse since the rope work." She leaned forward. "You didn't wrap it afterward like I told you. I forgot." Harlan, he was quiet for a moment. "It hurts when it rains," he said finally, which was the most he'd admitted to in 6 weeks, and they both knew it. "And it's going to rain." "I know it's going to rain," she said. "That's why I need you functioning." She got up and went to the shelf where she kept the liniment and brought it back and held it out to him. He took it. She sat back down. Vernon's going to keep coming back, he said. He was looking at the fire. I know. He's not wrong that one bad winter could finish things here. He's wrong about what to do about it, but he's not wrong about the situation. What would it take to finish things? Clara asked. He looked at her with a slight surprise, like he'd expected her to argue the premise. Losing the cattle, the hay. If we lose a significant part of the herd to a bad storm we haven't prepared for, he stopped. The land's not producing enough other income right now. We'd be finished by spring, all right, Clara said. All right, he repeated with the faint perplexity of a man who doesn't know what you're agreeing to. I mean, all right, so that's what we're working against, she said. Losing the cattle, the hay, those are the two things we can't let happen. He looked at her for a moment. The hay's been restacked. We did that, yes, and we need one more thing before November, which I've been putting off because I wasn't sure we had the materials for it, but I think we do. She'd been turning this over for the past 4 days, working the math on the available timber and the amount of additional windward protection the northwest side of the cattle pasture needed. The windbreak was working, she could see it working, but there was a gap on the northwest corner of the pasture fence, where the terrain dipped slightly and the wind accelerated through the low point like water through a narrowed channel. She'd watched 3 of the cattle positioning themselves consistently away from that corner, which was the kind of behavioral information that Margaret's journals had taught her to take seriously. She told him what she was planning, and he listened. And when she was done, he said, "That's going to take more rail timber than we have in the shed. There's timber in the old lean-to behind the equipment shed. Some of it's weathered, but the cores are sound." He looked at her with a slow, considering attention. "You've been through the lean-to last week," she said. "I go through everything eventually." A beat of silence. Then something happened in Harlan's expression that she hadn't seen before, not quite a smile, but related to one. The loosening of a face that has been holding itself closed for a long time. "Margaret used to say the same thing," he said quietly. "She goes through everything eventually." He looked at the fire. "Drove me half crazy when we were first married, finding her in every corner of the place with that expression you have right now." Clara didn't know quite what to do with that, so she said nothing. "But she didn't look away. She'd have liked you," Harlan said. Not warmly, not sentimentally matter-of-factly the way Harlan said most things. She didn't have much patience for people who couldn't see a problem clearly. She'd have respected you. The word landed differently than compliments usually did for Clara, which was rarely. It landed because it came from the right direction, not flattery, not patronizing acknowledgement, but recognition. Offered plainly by a man who said exactly what he meant and no more. "Thank you," Clara said. Harlan nodded once. "My knee's fine," he said, unscrewing the liniment jar. "Go finish your ropes." She almost smiled. She went back outside. The thing about November on the Wyoming prairie, Clara had come to understand, was that it didn't negotiate. It arrived with whatever it had decided to bring, and it brought it on its own schedule, and the only variable it offered you was whether you'd been paying attention beforehand. She had been paying attention. She'd been paying attention to everything the weather journals, the cattle, the frost lines in the low ground. The way the creek had been running lower than Margaret's records suggested was typical for this time of year, which was one of the signs she'd been tracking most carefully. Low water in the creek before a hard winter. Margaret had written it 3 times across 3 different journals, always connected to the same outcome: severe cold arriving before December, faster than people expected, harder than the previous winter's memory had prepared them for. Clara had noted this, and she had not said it plainly to Harlan. She had said the winter was coming early and hard, which was true, but she had not yet said the full version of what she thought, which was that based on everything she could read, this particular winter had a chance of being the worst Cinder Creek had seen in at least 10 years, possibly longer. She hadn't said it because she had no absolute certainty and because scaring a man into inaction was not useful. But she had acted on it, Everything she'd done in the past 6 weeks had been acted on it. The northwest corner of the pasture fence was the last thing she needed to address. She worked on it over 2 days, Nell helping, Harlan passing materials when she needed them and not commenting on the design, which had its own kind of asymmetrical, functional geometry that Clara had worked out in her head and was executing by hand. The cattle gradually shifted their position in the pasture over those 2 days, moving closer to the northwest corner as the structure went up, which was the behavioral confirmation she'd been waiting for. Animals understood shelter instinctively in ways that took human beings a long time to learn. The pregnant cow, she was a broad roan that Harlan called Bess, with the offhand familiarity of a man who'd never bothered to explain the name, had been a source of low-level concern since Clara's second week on the property. The pregnancy was advanced, the birth was coming close, and the timing was poor in the specific way that biology sometimes produces poor timing without asking anyone's opinion. Clara had noted it, noted the signs, noted the way Bess was moving, and had added the barn preparations to her list without fanfare. She'd spent an afternoon making sure the calving stall in the barn was properly prepared, bedded deep, protected from the draft that came through the gap in the east wall, that gap now patched with the cedar planking she'd found in the lean-to. She'd organized the supplies they'd need, clean rope, the kit of tools she'd found in a chest near the barn door, and cleaned and laid out in order. She'd done all of this without saying to Harlan, "I think this calf may come at the worst possible time, in the worst possible conditions, and we need to be ready." Instead, she'd just done it, and Harlan had come into the barn on a Tuesday evening, seen the calving stall prepared with a thoroughness that implied forward thinking, and stood there looking at it for a moment before saying, "Bess?" "She's not far," Clara said. "You think it'll be soon." "I think we should be ready." He'd looked at the prepared stall, at the kit laid out by the wall. "When did you do all this?" "Last week," she said. "I wasn't sure how long we had." He exhaled slowly. "That cow's been the most complicated animal I've dealt with in 20 years, he said. "First pregnancy late in the season. She'll be all right," Clara said. She said it with more confidence than she completely felt, because what he needed right now was someone who had a plan and believed in it, not someone who shared his worry back at him. He looked at her sideways. "You sure about that?" "No," she said. "But we're as ready as we can be." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The closest thing to one she'd heard from him. The morning Vernon's letter arrived, left with the supply rider, not delivered in person, which told you something about Vernon's instincts for self-preservation, was also the morning Clara woke up and smelled the change in the air before she opened her eyes. She lay still for a moment, in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers over the past weeks, and breathed it in. Cold of a different character than yesterday, the specific dry, electric quality that the last entry in Margaret's most recent journal described as the thing that always came before. She got up before light, went to the kitchen, built up the fire, stood at the window and looked out at the dark, where nothing was happening yet, but the air itself felt like a held breath. She checked the guide ropes from the porch, all in place, properly tensioned, the knots sound. She checked the barn, found Bess restless in a way that she noted and didn't like, found the hay still dry, found the water supply adequate. She checked the chimney from outside, craning her neck to see the top in the dark seated properly, cap in place. Harlan was up when she came back inside. He had the letter in his hand. He'd opened it. "Vernon's made a formal offer," he said. "In writing this time, with a lawyer's signature on it." Clara poured herself coffee. "What are you going to do with it?" "Same thing I do with the other 3, he said, and set it on the table with the finality of something that had been decided before it arrived. Clara looked at him. He was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark the same way she'd been looking at it from the porch, reading it, though he didn't have the weather journals and didn't have her particular way of putting observations together. He had something else. Decades of this land, decades of this sky, A body that still remembered what the air felt like before a bad one, even when his mind hadn't finished processing it. "Coming today," he said. "Not a question." "I don't know if it'll be today," Clara said carefully. "Or tomorrow," he said. "Close." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Close," she agreed. They looked at the dark together for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen that was warm now in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. "The ropes are in place," she said. "The hay is covered. The cattle are in the protected pasture. The calving stall is ready." She paused. "We've done what we can do." Harlan turned from the window. His expression was the one she'd come to know best, not hopeful, not afraid, not resigned. Something more functional than any of those. The look of a man who has looked at what's coming and decided to meet it straight on because there is no other direction to meet it from. "There's one more thing," he said. She looked at him. The guide rope, the one from the far end of the porch to the chimney access point on the roof edge. "I didn't see it out there." Clara had not put that rope in place because she hadn't thought about the chimney vent. She'd thought about the ground-level guide ropes house to barn, barn to well, well to tool shed. She had not thought about the chimney vent becoming buried and what that would mean, the smoke backing up, carbon monoxide, the fire becoming a danger instead of a survival mechanism. She felt the error the way you feel an error when you've been trying very hard not to make them, with a cold, clarifying clarity that doesn't leave room for feeling bad about it, only room for fixing it. "I'll put it in place this morning," she said. "I'll help," he said. "Your knee, I'll hold the other end," he said, in the tone that meant the discussion was finished. He put on his coat. Clara put on hers. They went out into the dark together, into the air that smelled of what was coming, and they fixed the last rope in place before the light fully arrived. It wasn't elegant work. The anchor point at the roof edge took 3 tries to secure in a way that Clara was confident would hold under ice load, and Harlan's hands were stiff from the cold before they'd been out 10 minutes, and the rope itself was heavier than it looked and harder to manage in the pre-dawn dark. But when it was done right. Clara stood on the porch and looked at the sky in the east where the light was beginning to come in low and pale and without warmth, and she thought about everything she'd put in place over 6 weeks, and she thought about what Margaret's journals said happened during the bad winters, and she thought about Nell and asleep inside. She thought about the last morning she'd stood somewhere with this much at stake and what that had felt like. She had been standing in a small house in Nebraska, looking at George's medical bills on the kitchen table, and knowing that the life they'd planned was not the life they were going to have, and that the question was not how to get back to what had been, but whether she was capable of building something from what was left. She had found out the answer to that question over the following 14 months of moving and failing and moving again, and knocking on doors and being told no until the door that finally opened was this one. Crooked sign and cold smoke and an old man with a damaged knee who hadn't wanted to let them in. She looked out at the sky, the pale nothing of it, the white that was gathering at the edges. It wasn't coming today, but it was close. She went inside to start breakfast, because whatever was coming, they would face it having eaten well, having slept, having done everything that could be done. That was all there was. You prepared, and then you met what came, and you didn't look away from it. Behind her, the guide rope ran taut and steady from the porch post to the roof edge, just where it needed to be. The blizzard did not come that day, or the next. It came 4 days later, before dawn on a Thursday, and it came the way the worst ones always come, not building slowly, not giving you the courtesy of a warning you could feel in time to act on it, but arriving nearly fully formed, like something that had been waiting just beyond the horizon and had simply decided the moment had come. Clara was already awake when it hit. She'd been awake for an hour, lying still in the dark of her small room, listening to the silence that had settled over the property the night before with the specific qualities she'd learned to distrust. Too quiet. The cattle had gone still. The wind had dropped completely just after midnight, which Margaret's journals said was not a good sign, not calm before a storm in the poetic sense, but an actual meteorological condition. a pressure change that preceded the worst systems by 3 to 5 hours. She'd lain there doing the math for an hour and then gotten up. She was at the kitchen stove when she heard it begin, not snow falling, not wind arriving gently, but the sound of the whole sky deciding at once. A roar that wasn't a single thing but a combination of things, wind at a speed that turned solid objects into hazards, snow moving horizontally rather than vertically, the temperature dropping so fast you could almost hear the air contract. The cabin walls shuddered with the first real gust, in a way she had not heard them shudder since she'd fixed the windbreak. And even now, even with everything she'd done, the force of it was something else entirely. Harlan appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds after it started. He was already dressed, which meant he'd been lying awake the same way she had, listening, calculating, waiting. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. There was nothing to say that the sound outside wasn't already saying more clearly. "The cattle are in the protected pasture," Clara said, going through the list in her head out loud. "Hay is covered. Water supply was adequate as of last night. Barn door is latched from the inside." She paused. Bess. Harlan's jaw tightened. She wasn't right yesterday evening. "I know." Clara had checked on her twice before dark, and the roan had been restless in the particular way that meant soon rather than eventually. "She may be in labor in this," Harlan said. It wasn't a question. He was looking at the wall as if he could see through it to the barn. "We have the calving stall ready," Clara said. "We have the supplies." She was already moving, pulling on her coat from the hook by the door, the heaviest one. The one she'd sewn an extra lining into last week, using wool batting she'd found in the chest with Margaret's quilting materials. Harlan had looked at her questioningly when she'd asked if she could use it, and she'd shown him what she was making, and he'd said, "Use whatever you need." "I'll go out and check on her," Clara said. Harlan moved toward his own coat. "I'll go with you. Your knee won't manage." "Clara." His voice was quiet and final. She stopped arguing. She wrapped her scarf twice around her face, pulled her hat down, and they both went to the door together. The cold when she opened it was not the cold she'd been experiencing. For 6 weeks it was a different order of magnitude. The kind that got inside the barrier of clothing faster than you expected and started working on the skin before you'd fully processed what was happening. She grabbed the guide rope with both hands before she'd taken 2 steps off the porch. She felt it immediately, the vibration of it, in the wind, taut and real and solid, in a way that nothing else in the white world around her was solid. She couldn't see 3 feet in front of her. She could see the rope. She moved along it hand over hand, Harlan behind her. Progress was slow. The wind pushed against them at an angle that required constant compensation, leaning into it like a wall. Snow was not falling so much as existing everywhere at once, in her eyes, in the gap at her collar, in her lungs when she breathed. The barn door. She found it by feel, by the rope's endpoint, by the specific resistance of the handle under her gloved fingers. She pulled it open, and they got inside and pulled it closed behind them. And for a moment she just stood in the relative stillness of the barn interior and breathed. Animals were awake. All of them. In the restless collective alertness that prey animals go into when conditions become threatening, not panicked, but very present, very aware. And from the calving stall at the far end came a sound that confirmed what Clara had suspected since the night before. Bess was in labor. Harlan moved past Clara toward the stall, and she followed, and what they found was not the worst case, but was close to it, the cow on her feet. Turning in the tight space, the birth clearly underway and clearly complicated. Clara could see it immediately. The calf was positioned wrong, one leg forward and one not. The presentation that turned a difficult thing into a dangerous one. "She's been at this a while," Harlan said. His voice had gone very level, in the way of a man who defaults to calm when the situation goes sideways, because he's learned that panic is the one luxury no working rancher can afford. "I know," Clara said. She was already pulling off her outer coat and rolling up her sleeves in the cold barn air, and the part of her that registered the cold registered it and then set it aside. She'd done this once before, 7 years ago on her brother-in-law's farm in a different kind of emergency, and George had been beside her, then talking her through it, and he wasn't here now, but the knowledge he'd helped her build was. "I'm going to need more light," she said. "And Nell?" Harlan looked at her. "Nell's a child. Nell is steady and she follows instructions, and I need an extra pair of hands in here," Clara said. "She can manage it. She's managed harder things than this." He accepted that with a nod and went back out into the storm for his daughter. Clara was alone in the barn with the laboring cow and the sound of the blizzard pressing against every surface of the structure, and she breathed steadily and went to work. The lantern gave her enough light to see by, but not as much as she wanted. She worked by feel as much as sight, the way George had told her you had to, when the conditions were what they were hands first, reading by touch what your eyes couldn't fully tell you. The position of the calf, what needed to move, and in what direction. Bess turned her great head and looked at Clara with the exhausted, wild-eyed trust of an animal that understood on some level that this person was trying to help. Clara talked to her steadily as she worked, not sweet talk, not coaxing exactly, just words, the human sound of calm intention, because animals responded to tone before they responded to anything else. Harlan came back with Nell, and behind Harlan, half frozen and barely upright, was someone else. Clara looked up from the stall and saw him, a man she didn't recognize, large and frost-covered, being half carried by Harlan through the barn door. His coat was wrong for the conditions, the kind of coat that was fine for a cold day, but not for a whiteout at this temperature. His face was pale in the specific way of a person who has been outside in severe cold for longer than their body was equipped to manage. "Found him at the fence line," Harlan said, "the east fence." "He was down." "Who is he?" Nell asked. "Orson Hale," Harlan said. "Neighbor. His spread is a mile east. He was getting the man to the barn wall, propping him against the boards." The man Hale was conscious but marginally, his eyes moving without full focus. "Hands and feet first," Clara said from the stall. "Check his hands and feet. If his fingers are white, you need to warm them slowly, not fast. And there's a blanket in the chest by the east wall. Nell, go." Nell went without a word. "I can't leave Bess," Clara said to Harlan. "Can you manage him?" "I'll manage," Harlan said. What followed was the kind of hour that you carry for the rest of your life, not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to you, but because of what it revealed about everyone in it. Clara, working in the calving stall with Nell beside her, passing things when she asked, both of them in the cold without complaint, focused the way people focus when the stakes have stripped away everything that isn't essential. Harlan crouched against the wall, tending to a man he clearly had complicated feelings about. Neighbors in that part of Wyoming existed in a relationship of mutual necessity that didn't always produce warmth. And Clara had gathered enough from 6 weeks of listening that Orson Hale was not the man whose opinion Harlan valued most. But he was a man who had gone down in the snow outside the fence line, and Harlan had not left him there, because that wasn't something Harlan Crowe was capable of, whatever else he was or wasn't. Hale regained enough of himself after 30 minutes with the blanket and proximity to the animal's warmth to sit up on his own and look around the barn, with the gradual returning awareness of a man assembling recent events back into order. He looked at Harlan, at the children, at Clara working in the far stall. "My barn's gone," he said. His voice was rough, stripped down by cold. "The roof, it gave way under the load," he stopped. "I had 6 head in there." Harlan said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "Trying to get to..." Hale stopped again. "I don't know where I was trying to get to." "I couldn't see anything." "You made it to my fence line," Harlan said. That was far enough. Hale looked at him with the expression of a man who has just understood how close a thing it was, and who doesn't quite know how to hold that yet. He looked at the guide rope still coiled at the barn entrance, the one that had run from the fence post to the barn door, the one Clara had strung in the dark weeks ago against exactly this kind of need. and he didn't say anything about it because he didn't know yet what he was looking at or why it was there. He would understand it later. From the calving stall came a sound that pulled everyone's attention at once, not Bess, but Clara, a single sharp word of instruction to Nell, and then a silence that had a different quality than the silence before it. Harlan got to his feet. Hale turned his head. Nell had gone very still. Clara was working with both hands, her whole upper body at an angle, her face set in the concentrated expression of someone doing something that requires everything they have and is not going well and must go well anyway. The calf was almost out, almost, and not moving the way it needed to move. The barn was very quiet except for the storesome outside and the sound of Bess's labored breathing and the small sounds of Clara working. And then the calf came free, and Clara caught it with both arms, and it was limp and pale and wrong-looking. And she turned it and did the things that needed doing, clearing the airway, the stimulation, the specific motion she'd seen done once and had never had to replicate until now, working at it with a focus that didn't allow for the thought that it might not work, because that thought wasn't useful. The calf did not breathe. 10 seconds. 15. Nell made a sound that she cut off immediately, pressing her lips together. Clara kept working. 20 seconds, the calf breathed. One breath, small and wet and uncertain, then another. Then it moved a leg first, just a reflex, and then the whole body with the uncoordinated urgency of something discovering that it exists and is not sure what to make of that. Nell made the sound again, this time not cut off, and it wasn't a word exactly, just the sound of a 10-year-old who has been holding herself at adult steadiness for the past hour, suddenly releasing it all at once. Clara sat back on her heels in the straw and looked at the calf and breathed. She became aware slowly of several things at once. Cold in her arms up to the elbows, the ache in her back. Harlan standing at the stall entrance with his hand on the wood, and his expression doing something she'd never seen it do before open, fully, in a way that he hadn't earned the right to hide it yet. Hale sitting against the wall with his blanket around him, looking at the stall. Toby, she realized, was also in the barn she hadn't known when he'd come in, but he was sitting in the hay near the door, very still, watching with the serious face of a 6-year-old who understood something important had just happened even if he couldn't have named what it was. Bess turned and began to clean her calf with the absent efficiency of maternal instinct that has nothing to do with what the calf's arrival cost either of them. "Good girl," Clara said to her quietly. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the cow. Outside, the blizzard hadn't moderated at all. It was, if anything, worse. The wind had found another gear somewhere in the past hour, and the barn structure was taking the force of it in a way that made sounds she didn't love. But the structure was holding, the repairs to the southwest corner, the planking she'd put in to close the gap, the reinforced door latch it was holding. She pulled herself to her feet and addressed the practical situation, because the practical situation was ongoing, and standing in the stall feeling things was not going to help it. "Nell," she said, "go get the extra blankets from the chest. The calf needs to stay warm, and so does Orson." She looked at Hale, who was watching her with an expression she'd seen before on men, who had decided something about a person without being asked, and were now in the process of revising it. She didn't have energy for that right now. Harlan came into the stall beside her, and they did the work together, checking Bess, settling the calf, making sure the stall was properly arranged for the night. They worked close to each other in the small space, arms occasionally crossing paths, neither of them saying much because not much needed to be said. There was a companionship in it that Clara noticed and didn't examine, because examination was a luxury for conditions that were less immediate than these. "Vent," Harlan said suddenly. Clara looked up. "The chimney vent," he said. If it's been snowing like this for 2 hours, she'd already thought of it. She'd thought of it 40 minutes ago and had set it aside while the calf was her immediate problem and was now pulling it back up to the front of her attention with the particular cold feeling of a task that has waited as long as it can wait. The chimney vent on the roof, The cap she and Bram Dorsey had installed in October was designed to redirect wind, not to handle the volume of drifting snow that a storm like this produced. If the drift had built up around the base of the cap, if the vent was even partially blocked, the carbon monoxide from a fire would start backing up into the house. They had a fire burning. She'd built it up specifically before they came out to the barn, knowing they'd be gone a while. Nell and Toby were in the barn, which was not the house. But the fire was in the house, and if the vent blocked and the smoke backed up into an empty house, the problem was contained. But they couldn't stay in the barn indefinitely, and when they went back inside, they'd be going into whatever the air in there had become. "I have to clear the vent," she said. Harlan looked at her. The guide rope goes from the porch to the roof edge above the kitchen," she said. "I put it there 4 days ago. It's in place." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was working through what she'd just said, the implications of it. The fact that she'd thought of this possibility weeks ago and prepared for it specifically, the fact that the rope was there precisely because she'd imagined this moment. "I'll go," he said. "Your knee won't hold on an iced roof," she said. "You know it won't," he knew. She could see him knowing it in the set of his jaw, the frustration of a man whose body has put a wall between him and what he needs to do. "Can't go up there alone in this. I'm not going on the roof," she said. "I just need to get to the roof edge and reach the cap from the access point above the kitchen window. There's a foot of clearance there. I measured it when we put the rope up. I don't have to be fully on the roof, just to the edge." This was technically true. It was also true that the access point above the kitchen window was still an exposed position on an iced surface in a whiteout in temperatures that would cause problems with grip and balance and visibility and every other factor that made the task reasonable versus the task reckless. "I'll hold the rope from the porch," Harlan said. "I'll anchor it." "Yes," she said. That was what she needed. She told Nell to stay with Toby and the calf and Hale in a tone that Nell had learned over many months to understand meant, "This is not a request, and I need you to be exactly what I know you are." Nell looked at her mother for a moment and then said simply, "All right," which was how Clara knew her daughter was going to be fine. They went out into it. Harlan at the rope behind her on the porch, leaning his weight against it, bracing his good leg against the porch post. Clara moving forward along the rope with her hands, into the white that was not a color, so much as an absence of everything that wasn't white, into the wind that was not a force so much as an environment that opposed every movement with an opinion about it. She found the porch post, found the wall, moved along the wall by touch, the rope above her head now, leading upward to the roof edge. The cold was a specific, active thing at this temperature. It wasn't in the background. It was present, demanding continuous acknowledgement, working at every exposed surface with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. She reached the roof edge. The access point, the 2-foot section of low overhang above the kitchen window that she and Harlan had specifically identified as the place from which the chimney cap could be reached without having to go fully onto the roof surface. She'd stood there in October, in calm weather, and reached up and touched the cap with her fingertips and understood that it was possible. In those conditions it had been easy. In these conditions it was not easy. She got her footing on the window ledge ice-covered, but with enough grip with her heel wedged into the frame and reached up and felt for the cap. Snow and ice had built up around the base of it exactly as she'd feared, not blocking it entirely but partially, enough to reduce the draw to something that would cause problems over another few hours. She worked at it with her fingers, breaking the ice away from the base, clearing the gap around the cap's lower edge. The cold in her hands moved from discomfort to something more serious somewhere in the middle of the work, and she noted it and kept working. The cap cleared. She could feel the suction of proper draw when she passed her hand beneath it, the chimney breathing again, the slight warm draft from far below. She got back down, followed the rope back to the porch. Harlan grabbed her arm when she reached him, and for a moment she just stood there on the porch in the wind, pressing her hands under her arms. letting the blood come back to her fingers with the specific pain of returning circulation that is unpleasant and welcome in equal measure. "Done," she said. Harlan's hand was still on her arm. He let go after a moment. "All right," he said. "Get inside." They both went inside, stamping snow, stripping outer layers with the clumsy efficiency of people whose hands aren't working well. The house was warm. The chimney drew perfectly. Clara stood in the kitchen and felt the warmth and felt her fingers and breathed. The storm continued. There was nothing to do about the storm continuing except manage what could be managed and wait out the rest. Clara made food actual, substantial food, because a barn full of people managing an emergency in severe cold needed calories, and she had the supplies to provide them. She made 3 trips between the house and the barn over the course of the day. Each time on the guide rope, each time with something hot food the first time, or blankets the second, a medical kit for Hale's hands the third, because frostbite is not always dramatic at first, and being careful about it costs nothing. Hale was better by midday. Not well, he was going to have problems with 2 of his fingers for weeks, and his feet were going to be painful when they properly warmed but conscious and coherent, and sitting up under his own power, which was a significant improvement from the state in which Harlan had dragged him through the barn door. He was quiet for most of the morning, watching. The kind of watching that happens when a person has had a close call and is still processing the proximity of it, still running the alternate version in their head. What happens if the fence line had been 20 yards further? If the rope hadn't been there? If the barn door had been anywhere other than exactly where it was? In the afternoon, while Clara was checking the calf again, Hale spoke. "Why is there a rope at your fence line?" he asked Harlan. Harlan looked toward Clara, not in a way that deflected the question, but in a way that credited the answer to the right person. "Clara put it in," Harlan said, 6 weeks ago. "Guide ropes. From the house to the barn to the well, fence line to the shed. In case of whiteout conditions." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Weeks ago," he said slowly. "Yes, she was planning for this." "She was planning for the possibility," Clara said from the stall. "Margaret's journals said bad winters come without much warning out here. I wanted to be ready." Hale looked at the rope again with the expression of a man revising a large number of things simultaneously. He'd heard about Harlan's new cook everyone in a 10-mile radius had heard, because news of any kind moved quickly in that kind of sparse country, and news of a woman redesigning a ranch was especially interesting to people who had opinions about what women should and shouldn't be redesigning. He'd heard Alderman's version of it, which had been delivered with a particular kind of amusement that Hale had mostly shared at the time, because Alderman was a hard man to disagree with when you were standing in his yard, and he was in the middle of his point. He wasn't in Alderman's yard now. He was sitting in Harlan Crowe's barn, wrapped in a blanket, with fingers he was going to feel for the rest of the winter, alive in a way he would not have been if the fence rope and the barn door had not been exactly where they were. The second night of the storm was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because the cold deepened and the wind didn't let up, and the structure of the barn was taking a sustained beating that produced sounds that required deliberate ignoring. Easier because they had settled into the emergency, by then had organized it, understood its shape, established who was responsible for what and when. Clara and Harlan took turns through the night checking the animals, managing the heat sources, making sure Hale's condition wasn't deteriorating. Nell slept in the hay near the calf and would have stayed awake if Clara had let her, but Clara did not let her. Toby had been asleep since shortly after supper, curled against the barn wall with his father's tin cup in his hand in the unconscious way he had of reaching for it. When he was stressed, he didn't remember doing it. Clara was fairly certain. And she'd decided some time ago that the cup was his, and the holding of it was his, and she wasn't going to make it into something to address. She noticed Harlan noticed the cup at one point during the night. In the quiet way, he noticed everything he didn't comment on. The third morning, the storm broke. It didn't end gradually. It ended the way it had begun, with a kind of decision the wind dropping from catastrophic to merely significant over about 2 hours, the snow stopping with the abruptness of something that had finished rather than concluded. The light that came in through the gaps in the barn boards was different actual light, with color in it, the pale blue-white of a cleared sky. Clara opened the barn door and looked out at the world. Wyoming in the aftermath of a blizzard of this kind was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was enormous and white and utterly indifferent to what it had done or who it had done it to. Drifts had built against every structure, against the fence lines, against the guide ropes. The guide ropes were still there, buried under snow, but still taut when she dug down to find them, still attached at both ends. The windbreak had held. She could see it from the barn door still standing, still angled correctly, the snow distributed along its length and around it in the pattern she'd intended, pushed sideways along the fence line rather than driven through into the property. The hay in the barn was dry. She checked it specifically because she needed to know. Dry, all of it, the elevated platform, the waterproof canvas, the repaired roof, it had all held. She stood in the barn doorway in the cold morning light and took stock. They had lost nothing, not a single animal. The cattle in the protected pasture were cold and needed feed and attention, but they were standing. The calf born in the worst of the storm was alive, and increasingly insistent about it, already pulling at Bess with the emphatic demand of something that has decided it intends to exist fully and immediately. Hale was alive. His fingers were going to give him trouble, but he was alive. Harlan had slept 4 hours and was already up and moving on a knee that was going to cost him for weeks, but he was moving. The chimney above the kitchen sent smoke straight up into the blue morning sky. Clara stood there for a long time, not because she'd earned it, not as a celebration, but because she needed a moment to let the inventory settle to make sure she had it right, to make sure the accounting was accurate. Everything she'd prepared, everything she'd thought through and built, and argued for and rebuilt and stayed up late calculating. It had worked. Not perfectly, nothing works perfectly. She knew that better than most, but enough. In the ways that mattered, in the margins that determined survival, it had worked. Behind her, Toby appeared in the barn doorway, squinting in the light, his hair entirely on one side of his head from sleeping. He looked out at the white world. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," she said. He looked at the snow for another moment. Then he held up his father's tin cup, which he'd apparently been holding in his sleep. He looked at it, then out at the property, then at his mother. "Can I put this down somewhere?" he asked. "I don't think I need to carry it today." Clara looked at her son, at the cup, at the blue sky above the chimney. "You can put it down," she said. He set the cup carefully on the barn windowsill, not thrown down, not abandoned, just set down gently, deliberately, the way you set down something that mattered before you go out to do something else. Then he walked out into the snow, which was deeper than he was tall in the drifts, but not everywhere, and he found a passable path and kept going, small and serious and very much his father's son, toward the fence line where the guide rope ran just under the surface, and the morning was cold and bright, and the hardest part was over. The days after the blizzard had a particular quality that Clara had never experienced before and wouldn't have known how to describe to someone who hadn't lived through something similar. It wasn't relief exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like the feeling of a held breath finally let out the body's slow return to its ordinary rhythms after days of running on something harder and more concentrated than ordinary life. The work was immediate and physical, and in some ways easier than the preparation had been, because now the problems were visible and concrete rather than hypothetical. Drifts to be cleared, animals to be properly fed and assessed, damage to be inventoried and categorized into what could wait and what couldn't. Clara moved through all of it with the same systematic attention she'd brought to the chimney and the hay and the windbreak, but with something slightly different underneath it, a quieter quality, less driven by urgency. more by the simple satisfaction of doing things that needed to do in conditions that were hard but survivable. They were survivable. That was the fact she kept returning to in the small hours of those first days, not triumphantly, but with a kind of steady disbelief that gradually hardened into something she could trust. Orson Hale stayed at Cinder Creek for 3 days after the storm broke. He couldn't have gone back to his own property if he'd tried. The road between the two ranches was buried under 4 feet of drifted snow for the first 48 hours, and he wasn't in physical condition to attempt it regardless. His 2 middle fingers on the right hand had taken the worst of the frostbite, and Clara had spent the better part of the first morning applying the careful, graduated warming that frostbite required and explaining to him with clinical precision why doing it too fast would cause more damage than the cold itself had. He'd listened with the attentive silence of a man who had decided to trust the person talking to him, which was a different posture than the one he'd arrived in. He wasn't easy company. He was a man who'd spent most of his adult life forming opinions quickly and stating them plainly, and had built a comfortable enough existence around that approach that he hadn't developed much reason to question it. He and Harlan had the particular dynamic of 2 men who lived close enough to each other to need a functional relationship and far enough from each other that they'd never been required to make it a warm one. They were civil. They passed food to each other at the table and discussed practical matters with straightforward efficiency. And there was no hostility in it, but there was no depth either. What changed things, or began to, was the calf.
The calf, a bull calf, black with a white patch on his left shoulder that
Toby had immediately and solemnly declared made him look like a general was doing well by the second day. Better than expected, honestly. He was eating and moving and producing the kind of noise that said everything was in order internally, and Bess had settled into motherhood with a competence that Clara found obscurely reassuring, as if the cow's successful navigation of an extremely difficult birth was a general statement about the capacity of living things to manage harder circumstances than seemed reasonable. Toby spent most of his free time in the calving stall. He'd claimed a particular position in the hay near the stall gate and sat there with a seriousness of purpose that Clara found both endearing and useful, since having Toby there meant having eyes on both animals without anyone having to make a special trip. Hale watched Toby with the calf on the second morning, from across the barn, and said to Harlan, "Boy's not afraid of animals." "Never has been," Harlan said. It came out with a familiarity that surprised both of them slightly. Harlan speaking about Toby with the offhand certainty of someone who had been paying attention for a while. Hale looked at him, looked at Toby, looked at the calf, which had decided that Toby's boot was an appropriate thing to investigate, and was doing so with the dedicated nose of a creature that has recently discovered curiosity. "What's he going to name it?" "The General," Toby said, without looking up from 12 feet away. Hale's expression did something unexpected. It softened not dramatically, not in a way he would have acknowledged if you'd pointed it out, but enough to change the set of his face from its habitual reserve into something that had room in it for a 6-year-old boy, and a calf named for a military rank. "Good name," he said. Toby finally looked up. He studied Hale for a moment with the direct, assessing gaze that children deploy without understanding how disarming it is. "Your fingers look better," he said. "They were really bad yesterday." "They feel better," Hale said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. "Mama fixed them," Toby said, with a matter-of-factness that carried in it all the accumulated evidence of 14 months of watching his mother fix things. Hale looked across the barn to where Clara was working at the supply chest, reorganizing the calving kit and taking stock of what needed to be replaced. He looked at her for a moment in the way he'd been looking at her intermittently since the storm broke, reassessing, recategorizing, putting together a picture that didn't match the one he'd arrived with. He'd heard what people said about her. He'd said some of it himself, or something adjacent to it, in the comfortable way of a person agreeing with the prevailing opinion, because the prevailing opinion is easier than forming your own. A widow with no money and 2 kids who'd convinced old Harlan Crowe to let her redesign his ranch. That was the version that had circulated, and the verb in it, convinced, carried an implication that nobody had bothered to make explicit because it didn't need to be. People filled in the implication themselves. What he was looking at now was different. A woman who had strung guide ropes in the dark 6 weeks before he needed them. Who had reorganized hay storage against a rancher's resistance and been proven right in the first rain. Who had delivered a calf in a blizzard without fuss. Who had gone up to a rooftop access point in a whiteout to clear a chimney vent. Who had then come back inside and made food for everyone in the barn, including a neighbor she'd never met who had collapsed at the fence line. He sat with this for 2 full days before he said anything about it, which was about how long it took a man like Orson Hale to work through the distance between what he'd thought and what he now understood. On the morning of the 3rd day, before his son came to collect him on the newly cleared road, he came and found Clara in the kitchen, where she was reviewing the supply inventory, and crossed his arms over his chest in the posture of a man about to say something difficult. "I heard what Alderman said about you," he told her. "And I didn't argue with him." Clara looked up from the inventory. "I know, I should have. You didn't know me," she said. "There wasn't any particular reason to." "No," he said. "But I know you now, and I know what would have happened to me if you hadn't put that rope at the fence line." He stopped, cleared his throat in the way of a man for whom directness comes easily in some directions and costs something in others. "I thought you were fixing a house, making things nicer for the winter. I didn't understand that you were building something that could actually survive." Clara held his gaze for a moment. She didn't say "you're welcome," because the remark wasn't a thank you. Exactly. It was something larger than that. A recalibration, and it deserved to be received as such. "Your barn roof," she said. "When you rebuild it, I know someone who can look at the structural framing before you close it up. Bram Dorsey out of Kellam's Junction. He's good, and he's fair, and he'll tell you what will actually hold instead of what looks like it will." Hale looked at her for a second. "Dorsey, the blacksmith." "He does more than metalwork," Clara said. "He understands load distribution. He helped me with the chimney cap. He'll know what went wrong with your roof." Hale uncrossed his arms. He nodded once slowly, in the way of a man writing something down internally that he intends to act on. "All right," he said. "I'll find him." He left an hour later, his son driving the wagon, his bandaged hand resting on his knee, and Clara watched from the porch as they went down the newly cleared road, and then went back inside because there was still a great deal to be done. The weeks that followed the storm were a different kind of demanding than the weeks before it. The preparation had required anticipation, looking forward, calculating, building against something not yet visible. The aftermath required documentation of what had worked and what hadn't, an honest accounting of the difference. She made notes. She made them in a composition book she'd found in the back of the pantry during her first reorganization, blank, good quality paper, and she'd set it aside then, and now she returned to it and began writing in it every evening by the kitchen fire. Not a journal in the way Margaret's journals had been journals. Those were observational, phenomenological, the record of a woman watching the world carefully for decades. Clara's notes were more technical, what the windbreak had done and where it had been insufficient. How the cattle had distributed themselves in the protected pasture during the storm, and what that suggested about the positioning of the feed stations for next year. What the chimney cap had done well, and where the icing vulnerability had been, and how it could be addressed before another similar storm. She wrote about the guide ropes, where they'd been essential, and where she'd wished she'd put additional ones she hadn't. The section between the barn and the east fence, which was the section Hale had been found at, had a rope. But she hadn't put one going south along the fence line, which would have allowed a person moving along the fence from the neighboring property to have guidance without having to know in advance where Cinder Creek's fence was relative to the barn. She wrote this down. She wrote the solution down beside it. The rope should run along the exterior of the fence, not just within the property, a guide, not just for Cinder Creek residents, but for anyone moving through the area in whiteout conditions. This was a different kind of thinking than she'd started with. She'd started by thinking about this ranch. Now she was starting to think about the surrounding area as a system that either worked or didn't, and about what role Cinder Creek could play in making it work better. She didn't say any of this to Harlan yet. She was still figuring out what it meant. What Harlan did in those weeks after the storm was something she noticed gradually rather than all at once. He began taking her notes seriously in a formal sense, sitting down with her in the evenings, not just checking in or exchanging practical information, but actually working through the composition book with her, asking questions, offering what he knew about the property's longer history that she didn't have access to except through Margaret's journals. He knew things Margaret hadn't written down, because some things you don't write down when you live somewhere long enough you just know them, the way you know your own hands. He began telling her these things. The low point in the pasture where water pooled in spring thaw and made the ground unstable for 6 weeks. The section of the east fence that heaved reliably in the deep freeze because of an underground water channel nobody had ever bothered to reroute. The particular behavior of the creek in late winter, the way it ran higher before it iced over the second time, which was the freeze that held. He told her all of this over the course of many evenings, and she wrote it down beside her own observations and Margaret's, and the composition book became something she hadn't planned on it, becoming a document of everything 3 different people knew about how to keep Cinder Creek alive. The neighboring ranchers began coming by in February. The first one was a woman named Ruth Alderman, Curtis Alderman's wife, who arrived without her husband on a cold, clear Tuesday, knocked at the door, and asked Clara directly if she would be willing to walk her through what she'd done with the hay storage and the windbreak, because their hay situation going into next winter was not going to be workable if they kept doing it the same way. She said this plainly, without particular discomfort, in the way of a practical woman who had decided that her husband's opinions about what had happened here were less important than the actual information she could get by asking directly. Clara showed her everything. They spent 2 hours in the barn and another hour at the windbreak, and Clara answered every question Ruth asked with the specificity of someone who had worked out the reasoning and was not protective of it, because being protective of it would be absurd. What was the point of figuring out how to survive if you didn't pass it on? Ruth went home with diagrams Clara drew for her on paper torn from the composition book's back pages. She came back 2 weeks later with her neighbor Elspeth Crane, whose family ran a smaller spread on the west side of the Alderman property, and they walked through the same things and asked different questions, and Clara answered those too. Harlan watched this happening without comment for the first 2 visits. On the 3rd visit, when Clara was outside at the windbreak with 3 women and a man she didn't know, he came out and stood on the porch with his coffee and watched for a while, and then went back inside. That evening he was quieter than usual. Not troubled quiet, thinking quiet, which she'd learned to distinguish. "Curtis Alderman came to me last week," he said, over the supper dishes. Clara looked up. "I didn't know that. He came to check on the cattle situation after the storm. We talked." Harlan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "He didn't bring up what he said about you. Not directly. But he asked how the windbreak had held up. What did you tell him?" "I told him it held better than anything else on the property," Harlan said. Which is true. Clara was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything else? "He said he was going to be rebuilding his hay storage before next fall." Harlan paused. He didn't say why, but he looked like a man who'd had a conversation that cost him something. Clara went back to the dishes. She didn't feel satisfaction about Alderman exactly. It was too small a word for something more complex. She felt the particular resolution that comes when a problem that was never really about you in the first place stops being a distraction from the actual work. It was in late February on a Sunday afternoon that Harlan asked Clara to come into the main room. He was at his desk, the desk against the east wall that she'd noticed from her first week here, always with papers on it that he shuffled rather than organized. the functional desk of a man who had a complicated relationship with administrative tasks. Today the desk was cleared. There were two things on it. One was an envelope. The other was a folded document tied with a piece of twine. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He remained standing, which was how she knew he'd been planning this and was still nervous about it. "Your wages," he said, and pushed the envelope toward her. "What I said in the beginning, food and shelter until spring, then wages." Spring's close enough. Clara picked up the envelope. She could feel the weight of it was more than she'd estimated based on their original arrangement. Opened it and looked at the bills inside and was still for a moment. "This is more than we discussed," she said. "The original amount was based on a cook," Harlan said. "You weren't just a cook." He said it without inflation, without ceremony. A statement of accounting. Clara looked at the money for another moment. Part of her wanted to argue, on principle, the way she'd argued with herself for months about accepting charity from people who didn't mean it as anything other than charity. But this wasn't charity. This was a man who understood fair exchange and was executing it, and declining it on false modesty would be an insult to both of them. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He pushed the folded document across the desk. "That's the other thing." She set the envelope down and picked up the document. Untied the twine. The paper was heavy, good quality legal weight, the kind of paper that intends to mean something. She read the first paragraph and then read it again because her first reading had told her something she hadn't expected, and she wanted to be sure she had it right. She looked up at him. "Harlan, it's not charity," he said before she could say anything else. His voice had the particular quality it got when he'd made a decision and was absolutely certain of it and did not want to spend time defending it. "Read the whole thing." She read the whole thing. What it said, in the careful language of a county clerk who had clearly been given clear instructions by a man who knew what he wanted, was that Clara Whitlock and her children were to be recognized as permanent residents of Cinder Creek Ranch. Documented stake in the property's future, not ownership. Not yet, but something on the path toward it. A formal arrangement. Specific, detailed, signed by Harlan and witnessed by the county clerk and by Bram Dorsey, who turned out to have been part of this conversation at some point without Clara's knowledge. "This is," she started. "It's what you built," Harlan said. "This place was dying before you came. You can look at any part of it and tell me I'm wrong." "Couldn't. I'm not a young man," he said. "My knee isn't getting better." I don't have people, Clara. Vernon's not people. He's a calculation wearing a coat. And this property needs to continue past me." He stopped. "It should go to the people who know it, who've kept it." Clara sat with the document in her hands and let the full weight of what he'd done settle into her properly. Because it deserved to be understood at its actual size rather than deflected or minimized or turned into something smaller so it was easier to receive. She'd been moving since George died, moving because stopping meant not knowing where she was supposed to be. 3 ranches had turned her away. This one had nearly done the same, and then an old man with a damaged knee and a sign with 2 words on it had stepped back from the door and let her in, and she'd spent every day since then trying to make sure he didn't regret it. She hadn't been trying to build herself a home. She'd been trying to earn her place. But sometime between the chimney and the hay, and the windbreak, and the blizzard, and the guide ropes, and the calf born in a storm, and the neighbors who now knocked on this door for advice, sometime in there, the place had become home anyway. The way things become what they are, not through announcement, but through accumulated days of being treated as if they already were. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything," Harlan said. "Just don't leave." He said it with the directness of a man who has thought about what he wants to say for long enough that he's burned away all the ceremony. "I'm asking you to stay, not as cook, not as hired help. As whoever you are here, which is more than I had words for until the lawyer asked me to describe it and I had to find some." Clara looked at the document, then at him. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she said. Something crossed his face, not relief, because he'd been mostly certain, but the final settling of something that had been almost certain, which is a different feeling. He sat down. They sat across from each other at the desk for a moment, the two of them, with the composition book full of observations about Wyoming winters sitting on the shelf above the fireplace, and the chimney drawing clean above them, and the calf asleep in the barn across the yard. "Vernon's going to come back," Clara said. "He'll come back," Harlan agreed. "He always comes back. What are you going to do?" "Same thing I've been doing," Harlan said. "Tell him no. And this time I'm going to show him what that no means, instead of just saying it." Vernon came back in March, on a day when the last of the real snow was giving way to the heavy, unreliable slush of early thaw. He came in his good coat and with an air of patient reasonableness that he'd clearly spent time cultivating on the ride over. The expression of a man who believes that if he presents his case with enough equanimity, the other party will eventually stop being irrational. Harlan met him in the yard. Clara was at the fence line, checking the guide ropes for the seasonal maintenance she'd decided would be a permanent part of the property's annual cycle, checking the anchor points, replacing any section that had taken damage, extending the system along the east fence the way she'd planned since the night hail had been found. She was aware of Vernon's presence the way she was aware of weather. She kept working. She heard Harlan's voice, and then Vernon's voice, and then Harlan's again in a different register, not louder, but carrying something she recognized as the tone a man uses when he's done being patient with an argument he's already answered. Then she heard Harlan say her name. She set down the rope section she was working on and walked over. Vernon was standing in the yard looking at her with the expression of a man who has learned to regard her as a complicating variable. He looked at the guide rope she was still holding in one hand, at the fence line she'd been working on, at the calving stall visible through the open barn door, where the general was currently conducting his ongoing investigation of everything within reach, at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, which rose straight and clean in the cold March air. Harlan said to his nephew, "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Vernon fell into step because there wasn't a reasonable alternative. Harlan took him around the property the way you walk someone through, something you want them to actually see rather than just be told about. He took him past the hay storage, still dry, still elevated, still covered, the system that had saved the winter feed. He took him to the windbreak, which was still standing after the worst storm the area had seen in a decade, and he let Vernon look at it in silence. He took him to the barn and showed him the repaired roof, the patched east wall, the calving stall where the general was demonstrating his growing confidence in his own opinions. He took him to the kitchen. Nell was at the table doing her lessons. Toby was sitting on the floor with a piece of harness leather he'd been trying to braid for 3 days under Harlan's intermittent guidance. The kitchen was warm, properly warm, the deep, even warmth of a room that has a chimney working the way a chimney is supposed to work, a warmth that got into the walls and stayed there. Vernon stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the children, and at the room, and at the ladle on the wall beside Clara's wooden spoon. Margaret's old ladle that Harlan had taken down from where it had hung as a relic and placed beside the spoon in use, one beside the other, without explaining why and without needing to. "Where were you when the storm came?" Harlan asked his nephew. Vernon looked at him. 3 days, Harlan said. Storm lasted 3 days. "Where were you?" Vernon's jaw worked. "I was in Denver," he said. "The roads were—" "I know where you were," Harlan said. "I'm asking you to think about where you weren't." He pointed toward Clara, who was standing at the stove, who had come in from the fence work and was now making the afternoon coffee because it was afternoon, and this was what the afternoon involved. "She was here," Harlan said. "Nell was here. Toby was here." Orson Hale, from the next spread over, was half frozen at the fence line, and she dragged him in and kept him alive. Cattle are alive. The hay was dry. This kitchen was warm. He let a moment pass. What would this place look like right now if she hadn't been here? Vernon said nothing, which was the honest answer. "Open the offer if you want," Harlan said. "Read it to me. I'll listen." Vernon looked at him. You'll listen, and then I'll tell you no, same as I always have. But I want you to understand what you're trying to buy, because I don't think you've ever actually understood it. Harlan looked at the kitchen, at the children, at the 2 utensils on the wall. This isn't land. It's not an asset on somebody's ledger in Denver. This is where people live and die and keep living when everything tries to stop them. He looked at Vernon. You can't buy that. You can only be part of it or not. Vernon stood in the kitchen doorway in his good coat and looked at his uncle with the specific expression of a man who has arrived at a conversation expecting to guide it and has found that it already knows where it's going without him. He didn't open the offer. He left without saying much, his horse's hooves slow through the melting yard, and Clara watched from the window until he was down the road and then went back to the coffee without remarking on it. Nell looked up from her lessons. Is he gone? He's gone, Clara said. Is he coming back? Clara thought about it honestly. Maybe, she said. Some people take a long time to understand things. But he heard what needed to be said today. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Nell absorbed this. He's not a good person. He's a person who's made mostly bad choices, Clara said. That's a little different. Bad choices can change. Bad people are rarer than we think. Nell looked at her with the evaluative attention she'd had since she was very small, the look that meant she was deciding how true something was. Do you believe that? I'm working on it, Clara said. Which was the most honest answer, and Nell accepted it as such. Spring came the way spring in Wyoming always comes, not gently. Not with the steady warming progression that people who haven't lived in that kind of country expect, but in fits and starts, cold days interrupting warm ones, the ground thawing and refreezing, the creek running high and temperamental. The general grew at a pace that seemed almost aggressive, as if he'd decided to make up for the unpromising circumstances of his birth by being as demonstrably alive as possible. Toby visited him every day and maintained that he was a general and not a calf, and that the distinction was important. Dr. Everett Shaw came out from Kellam's Junction in April, which was something Harlan had mentioned to Clara 2 weeks prior, that Shaw was the livestock veterinarian who served most of the ranches in the area and had been meaning to come by since the storm to check on the cattle. Clara had said all right and gone on with other things, not anticipating that Shaw's visit would become anything more than a professional call. Shaw turned out to be a lean, observant man in his 50s who had the habit of people who spend most of their working life in practical assessment. He looked at things directly and formed opinions quickly and stated them without preamble. He spent 2 hours with the cattle, which was his primary purpose, and then walked the property with Harlan and Clara and asked questions that were more specific than she'd expected from someone whose professional concern was animals rather than infrastructure. He asked about the hay storage, about the windbreak, about the calving conditions during the storm. He looked at the guide ropes with the particular interest of someone who understood their purpose immediately and was tracing the thought process that had produced them. Who designed all of this? He asked. Clara did, Harlan said. Shaw looked at her. Where did you study? I didn't, Clara said. I read a great deal, and I paid attention. He walked the fence line where the guide ropes ran, testing the anchor points, checking the tension. He walked the windbreak from end to end. He looked at the elevated hay storage with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. I've been working out here for 22 years, he said finally. I've seen 3 bad winters in that time, one of them comparable to this one. He looked at Clara. I've seen what ranches look like on the other side of a winter like that when they weren't ready for it. He paused. And I've never seen a spread come through one the way this one did. Not just surviving actually intact. Nothing critical lost. Clara said we lost 2 fence sections on the south side. One of the water troughs cracked. Those are the things you lost, Shaw said. You want to know what your neighbors lost? Alderman lost 30% of his hay to moisture damage because it was ground stacked. The Crane family lost 4 cattle. Hale lost his barn. 2 families on the West Ridge had to abandon their spreads until the road cleared because they couldn't manage the livestock in those conditions. He looked at the property around them. You kept all your cattle. You kept your feed. You kept a man alive who would have died in that fence line. He stopped. What you built here, it should be what every ranch in this area is doing before next winter. Clara looked at him. Then tell them that, she said. You work with all of them. Tell them what to look at. I plan to, he said, with your permission to describe what you did here. You don't need my permission, she said. Tell them whatever will help. Shaw nodded. He looked at Harlan. You've got something valuable here. Not just the land. Harlan looked at Clara in a way that was brief and undemonstrative and communicated a complete thought without words. I know that, he said. The evening in late April, when Harlan put the wages on the table, had already happened weeks before, in that conversation at the desk with the legal document and the untied twine. But there was another evening in May, when the pasture was showing real green and the creek was running with the full-throated confidence of a waterway that has decided winter is over, when Clara came in from the fence work to find Harlan standing at the kitchen wall. He had Margaret's old ladle in his hand. He was looking at it with the expression she'd seen on his face in the first days, the one that held everything he'd been carrying since Margaret died. The 4 years of a man trying to keep a place alive without the person who had helped him understand what alive meant. Clara stopped in the kitchen doorway and watched him. He hung it back on the wall, beside her wooden spoon where he'd put it months ago. It wasn't a ceremony. It was just an old man hanging a ladle on a wall beside someone else's spoon, a simple act that meant something enormous to both of them, and neither of them was going to make a speech about. He turned and saw her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Coffee's on, he said. I know, she said. I can smell it. She came in and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and took hers to the window, where the pasture was green in the late light, and the cattle were moving slowly across it, and somewhere out there Toby was at the fence with Nell, running along the guide rope the way he'd taken to doing, using it as a starting line for races rather than as a safety measure, which was, Clara had decided, perhaps the best possible use for it. She stood at the window with her coffee and looked at her children in the green field and the clean smoke rising from the chimney behind her, and thought about the handcart and the 2 days of walking and the crooked sign and the door that had almost not opened. She thought about what it cost to keep moving when you had no particular reason to believe that moving was going to get you anywhere better than where you already were. What it cost to knock on another door when the last 3 had been closed in your face. What it required of a person to look at a dying place and see not what it was, but what it could still become. She thought about George, not with the grief that had been her first language for him, but with something quieter, the specific gratitude for a person who taught you things that outlasted them. Who gave you a way of seeing that you couldn't give back and didn't want to. She looked at the ladle on the wall, hers and Margaret's side by side, 2 women who had looked at this same difficult place and decided it was worth the effort. She thought there was something in that she couldn't quite name, not comfort exactly, not continuity in any tidy sense, but something real. Something true about the way places carry the people who've loved them, long after those people are gone. Nell came in first, boots muddy, hair wild from the wind, in the middle of telling Toby something important that he was half listening to while looking at his own hands. She stopped when she came into the kitchen and looked at her mother standing at the window, and for a moment just stood there, reading the hands, the set of the shoulders, the quality of the stillness. "Everything all right?" Nell asked. Clara turned from the window. "Everything's all right," she said, and this time, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to choose between saying it and meaning it. They were the same thing. Nell looked at her for a beat longer, completing the assessment, and then turned to tell Toby the rest of whatever she'd been telling him, and the kitchen filled up with the ordinary noise of children and coffee and the creak of the old house settling into the evening warmth. Outside, the smoke from the chimney rose perfectly straight into the spring sky. The wind was still crossing Wyoming. It would always cross Wyoming. There was nothing to be done about that. No preparation thorough enough, no structure solid enough to stop it entirely. The wind was part of the deal. The cold was part of the deal. The hard winters and the failed harvests and the things that came apart faster than you could fix them, all of it, part of the deal. What you got to choose was whether you faced it from somewhere that was yours. Nobody inside Cinder Creek Ranch looked toward the road anymore. Not Nell, who had stopped packing their belongings when strangers arrived sometime around November and had never started again. Not Toby, who had set his father's tin cup on the barn windowsill and left it there, where it still sat, not abandoned, not forgotten, just resting in a place that had become permanent enough to put things down in. Not Clara, who stood at the window of a kitchen she had fixed and fed and fought for, in a house she had earned the hard way, on the land where she intended to die old. Not Harlan, who was on the porch drinking his evening coffee in the chair he'd carried outside, because the temperature was right for it now, watching the pasture go gold in the last light. On a ranch he had once been afraid would outlast him rather than the other way around. The winters would still come. They were ready.